Good evening, everybody. I am calling this work session of the Independent School District 279, calling it to order at 6:21 p.m. on Tuesday, January 14th. The purpose of the school board work session is to build trust and teamwork, to exchange information, and when applicable, to provide direction in order to facilitate efficient and effective decision-making at regular board meetings. Tonight's topic is the integrated facilities planning process. And board members, hopefully by the end of this, will understand and give feedback on facility recommendations to address the enrollment capacity, next generation learning spaces for elementary and secondary safety and security, for elementary and secondary education, safety and security issues, and activities needs. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Corey McIntyre.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and I want to welcome everyone in our audience who chose to come out and participate with us tonight. So thank you for being here. We have a lot to cover. I'm going to just quickly, before we get started, if you can refer to your materials, because of so much information to go through and for ease of use, we're going to ask you to kind of follow through the divided presentations. We've divided them into 4 sections. And because we put them in 4 sections, that gives you an opportunity to ask questions at the end of each section. At the end of those 4 sections, we'll also talk about our oversight task force next steps and where we go from there. And then there's hopefully some time left over for additional questions and answers for things you are wondering more about as we go through the night. So I'm going to try to pace us to get through everything tonight and go from there. But before I get any further, I would like to we always start with introductions. And I know we have name tags here, but it might help our audience to know who's at the table here. So could I have their board members? Maybe Kelsey, you want to start?
Kelsey Dawson-Walton, school board member.
Tanya Simon, school board member.
Mike Ostaffi, school board member.
Jackie Mosqueda-Jones, school board member.
Heather Douglas, school board member.
Kelly Parpert, assistant superintendent.
Steve Flisk, assistant superintendent.
Patrick Smith, interim assistant superintendent.
Sarah Varnick, district level principal.
Dave Mordock, coordinator of risk management.
Troy Schreifels, Director of Facilities and Transportation Operations.
Ron Meyer, Executive Director of Finance and Operations.
And I'm Corey McIntyre, Superintendent. So thank you very much. All right, let's get started. So we're going to jump right in. The purpose of our work session is to share with the school board the status of what we've been referring to previously as integrated facilities planning process, our process we've been going through here. And as you know, we've currently engaged in a comprehensive strategic planning effort at the same time as this work to define our future work for the district. This facilities planning process is an important element as we continue to plan our future moving forward. So as you can see from this slide, we're now branding this process, Building a Better Future. That's really to help us move from a study phase, an analysis phase, into, which actually has been going on for several years, into more of an action phase. All right. So those seated around the table and indicated here on the next slide are tonight's presenters, and they'll be presenting on the findings and recommendations and observations that we've been working on this evening. We also have a number of people in the audience that are members of our various teams that have contributed to this work and have been a vital part of putting this together in the presentation and all the work behind the scenes. So there's a number of people involved. We're not going to have time to introduce everyone, but I did want to acknowledge the hard work of many of our staff, and you'll hear more about that as we go through the evening in each section. Okay, so for our outcomes tonight, board members will understand and give feedback on the facility recommendations to address enrollment capacity, next generation learning spaces for elementary and secondary, safety and security, and our athletic activities. To attain this outcome, you see in your packet, again, how much work's been done. And I know we asked a lot of you to read through this and do some prep before tonight. So to do our best to move us along, again, I'm going to do our best and try to hang on to our agreements of being done around 9 o'clock. I'm gauging and kind of anticipating about 30 minutes for our enrollment and capacity section, about 30 minutes for next generation learning, roughly about 15 minutes for our safety and security, and 30 minutes for our athletic facilities before wrapping up with a preview of that oversight task force, and then hopefully again some remaining time for any lingering questions. In 2016, the school board approved a comprehensive long-term facility maintenance plan to address the extensive deferred maintenance needs across the district. That investment included not only mechanical infrastructure, such as heating and cooling systems, roofs, parking lots, etc., but also included the renovation of learning spaces that staff and students interacted throughout the school day in. So in preparation for this work, our facilities team started to ask the question, what would these renovated learning spaces look like in the future? At the same time that this planning work for LTFM was taking place, our Enrollment and Capacity Management Advisory Committee, commonly known as ECMAC, was created. This group is made up of community members, staff, and industry experts, and their role is to monitor and advise administration on enrollment and capacity-related facility needs. In the fall of 2018, ECMAC started to consider a short-term and a long-term approach to address capacity concerns in the district. It also became evident that the district has facility needs in the areas of safety and security and our athletic facilities. So in January of 2019, the district intentionally paused that short-term and long-term approach that ECMAC had been engaged in to allow time for a more comprehensive planning process to begin. So the district at that point partnered with Wold Engineering and Architects to develop a framework that would help us move forward with this work and for really our facility planning to meet the needs of the district and assist with that process. So with this model, it helped us organize the work and help us plan moving forward. And you can kind of see some alignment here on our physical conditions piece here. That really equates to our long-term facilities maintenance plan. Our capacity enrollment piece of this model really is being handled by our Enrollment and Capacity Management Advisory Committee. Our Risk and Emergency Management Advisory Committee is meeting that safety and security element. Our elementary and secondary next generation learning spaces and study teams really address that curriculum initiative and delivery point component. And our independent activities facilities audit that we completed recently really hits that athletic activities and student activities area. And then the community use element is something that's ongoing for us as we continue to look at every facet of our work. So we really tried to align our committee efforts to this model with the hopes of with a good framework we get to the best outcomes. When we got to the summer of 2019, really when I started, we needed to kind of move this process a bit further. And we started using that integrated facilities planning process, which now, as you can see on this document, we're using Building a Better Future. And that, we knew it was important to move towards including more voices in the many aspects of the work from our school communities. We included teachers, school leaders, and research teams, which included site visits to other school districts, as well as activities coordinators and involving them in the athletic facilities audit. And we included community voice in all the areas through our district advisory committee. So if you look at the left-hand side here, again, those study teams took that information and had touch points with each of our district advisory committees to have that community feedback. We also included student voice in the information collected on the next generation learning spaces. So all of this information that is being shared tonight through this work session is really intended to get you up to date on what we've been working on and tie this all together to give you a comprehensive picture at this point in time and then get your feedback moving forward. So with all that background being said, I'm going to get us right into the content, and I'm going to turn over here first to Ron Meyer, who's going to walk you through our Enrollment and Capacity Management Advisory Committee.
All right, thank you. Good evening, Chair Staffy, school board members, Superintendent McIntyre. So the first report that we're going to look at is in reference to what's in your orange folder. It's the ECMAC board report. ECMAC was established in 2016, and it was based on feedback from a task force that had been assembled with the intent to increase transparency and communication between the school district and the community it serves related to school enrollment and facility management. ECMAC was established to analyze information affecting enrollment, capacity, and building use, and then to generate some observations and some recommendations that would then be communicated back to district administration. Since its inception, ECMAC has operated under the following principles that really guide our work. For any observations and recommendations that would come forth from ECMAC, They would be concise and informed by data. They would align with our district and district racial equity work. They would be sustainable. They would identify and examine the implications for all students in the district. They would identify potential costs and consider funding strategy. And then they would be made with as much advance notice as possible when any change is recommended. So as part of the Building a Better Future process that Corey just outlined, ECMAC was charged with bringing forth observations and recommendations to address overcapacity conditions at buildings across our district. The current membership of ECMAC includes 24 community members, 12 staff members, 2 school board members, and a representative from Wold Architects. A comprehensive list of those group members can be found in Appendix A of your ECMAC board report. ECMAC met for a total of 7 times between September and December of 2019. This diagram shows the defined process that ECMAC has been operating under as we made observations and recommendations over the past few years. For the first 2 years, ECMAC operated in these first 3 boxes. We did a lot of learning about enrollment, facilities, assumptions, capacities, and the unique needs of different buildings. All of this supported the work of building a shared understanding of the needs in the district. In the spring of 2018, the superintendent gave staff direction to begin to develop options to address capacity concerns across the district. As Superintendent McIntyre mentioned earlier, ECMAC began to consider those options in the fall of 2018 with the goal of making a recommendation back to the superintendent in the spring of 2019. With the need for a comprehensive look at facility needs, that work was paused in January of 2019 before a recommendation was completed. After the pause, ECMAC continued in their work and they developed a summary of progress report that was presented to the school board in May of 2019. In the summary of progress, ECMAC recommended the continuation of the evaluation of options to address overcapacity at the elementary and secondary level, and to continue to monitor the future growth that was taking place and is taking place in the northwest portion of the school district. With that, ECMAC began their work in September of 2019 with extensive data review and analysis. This data analysis included our base assumptions. Appendix B in the ECMAC board report are the elementary and secondary assumptions. The elementary assumptions were created in 2017, and they were updated again this past summer, in the summer of 2019. And the secondary assumptions were created in the summer of 2019. These base assumptions help describe what each building should include, and they are critical to calculating the overall student capacity at each building. One of the options that surfaced in the 2018-19 school year to address overcapacity conditions at the elementary level was to move the STEM program from Weaver Lake Elementary to Oakview Elementary. As part of its district commission work to assess the district's magnet school programming, Magnet Schools of America also studied the feasibility of that option, and ECMAC heard the results and recommendations of that study. ECMAC also looked at a multitude of enrollment data points. November 1st enrollment data is the basis for the 5-year enrollment projection that is developed for budgeting as well as for facility planning purposes. ECMAC reviewed the current data as well as the forecasted data and how that compared to the capacity that was calculated for each of our buildings. In addition, enrollment for each building was compared to what the Minnesota Department of Education recommends for core space capacity, things such as gymnasiums, cafeterias, etc. Appendix C in your ECMAC board report shows the various data sets that were analyzed by ECMAC. Finally, for each option that was considered by ECMAC, data was presented that quantified the potential number of families that would be impacted, the costs and funding options for each of those options, and the estimated construction timelines. After analyzing the data that was presented, ECMAC made several observations. At the elementary level, Rice Lake Elementary continues to be over capacity now as well as in our 5-year projection. Currently, there are 105 students over capacity, and they're projected to be 140 students over capacity within the next 5 years. Since ECMAC started their work in 2016, Basswood Elementary has been projected to be over capacity. The current data, however, suggests that while Basswood is currently 30 students over capacity, they're now projected to be 30 students under capacity within the 5-year projection. Garden City Elementary is currently 20 students under capacity now, but they're projected to be 19 students over capacity within the 5-year projection. And finally, Fernbrook, with our best estimates for the 5-year anticipated growth in that northwest corner of our district, is expected to be 132 students over capacity within the 5-year projection. At the secondary levels, Maple Grove Senior High is currently 134 students over capacity, and they're projected to be 270 students over capacity in the 5-year projection. Park Center Senior High, based on the Minnesota Department of Education's guidelines, is projected to be over capacity for media center space. And all 3 of our comprehensive senior high schools are projected to be over capacity for cafeteria space, again according to those MDE guidelines. During the course of ECMAC's work this fall, several questions emerged that weren't necessarily in the scope of ECMAC's work, but members believe they were important to bring forth. These included, how do the current assumptions reflect the unique needs of buildings? Specifically, this is related to Garden City Elementary, which with the current base assumptions that we have established and that we use for our capacity calculations, it did not rise to does not rise to the level of needing capacity relief, which was a change from previous ECMAC findings. In the past, as you recall in previous summary of progress, Garden City was identified as a site that needed some capacity relief. According to the base assumptions as they stand and the current calculation, that's no longer the case. The second one is because ECMAC was solely focused this fall on overcapacity conditions, questions emerged about how undercapacity schools would be addressed. Also, our career tech needs now and in the future were questioned. And finally, what was the vision for our media center spaces and buildings, and how might that affect capacity? While ECMAC's role was not to address or answer these questions, they were forwarded to other district leaders and other study groups, and you will actually hear more about several of these in other presentations throughout this evening. After the observations were made regarding the most current data available, ECMAC considered 4 options to address overcapacity conditions at Rice Lake Elementary and Fernbrook Elementary schools, and 1 option to address overcapacity conditions at the 3 comprehensive high schools. As ECMAC considered these options, they looked at the estimated cost, the timeline, the minimum number of families affected that we estimated, and the post-construction capacity of each option. Also, ECMAC looked at the potential funding sources for each option, understanding that it's not within their scope to determine which funding source would ultimately be recommended. An overview of all of the options are included in Appendix F of your ECMAC School Board report. The elementary options include an addition to Oakview Elementary with boundary changes and continued monitoring of Garden City Elementary School and the Northwest Maple Grove growth. The second option is an addition to Rice Lake Elementary School with no boundary changes and continued monitoring of Garden City Elementary as well as the Northwest Maple Grove growth. The third option, an addition to Weaver Lake Elementary with a boundary change and continuing monitoring of Garden City in that northwest area. Keep in mind this option would keep the STEM program at Weaver Lake. It would create a small boundary around Weaver Lake, and students would be funneled into Weaver Lake to fill up the additional space that was created from the addition. The last option that was considered was to build the new elementary school on the land that the district owns in the northwest corner of Maple Grove, with boundary changes across the district to address not only the overcapacity conditions that we have in some schools, but also the undercapacity that we have in some schools. At the secondary level, the option considered was an addition at Maple Grove Senior High to address the capacity concerns for enrollment. Also to increase cafeteria space at all 3 comprehensive high schools. And then finally, to increase the media center space at Park Center Senior High. ECMAC went through a thorough process of analyzing each of the options presented. You will find a summary of ECMAC's feedback for each of these options in Appendix G of your ECMAC board report. After feedback and questions were submitted, staff created a question and answer document to address some of the lingering questions about each of the options. You will find this information in Appendix E of your ECMAC board report. After all of the analysis was complete, at the December 9th ECMAC meeting, members that were present determined there was consensus to eliminate the Weaver Lake addition option and the Oakview addition option from further consideration. They also had consensus to support the secondary option of an addition of Maple Grove Senior High, the increased cafeteria space at all 3 of the high schools, and to increase media center space at Park Center Senior High. ECMAC members were split in their support for the Rice Lake addition option and for the new elementary option, with nearly half of the group in attendance supporting each of those options. Each group then had dialogue on why they chose the option that they did, what would make each option successful, what the positive and negative implications of each option were, and what the oversight task force should consider with each of the options. The feedback from each of those groups is included in Appendix H of your ECMAC board report. After sharing that feedback with each other in the December 9th meeting, the consensus of the larger group was to bring both options forward as recommendations to the oversight task force. Therefore, the options recommended to address overcapacity conditions at specific elementaries and the 3 comprehensive senior high schools are the Rice Lake addition option, the new elementary option, and the secondary option. ECMAC still has some work to accomplish this year. There are 3 meetings scheduled for this spring, and we'll start to dive into making observations regarding undercapacity conditions at schools in our system, as well as to understand additional facility needs that may exist in some of our specialized programs. We will finish the year by completing the 2019-2020 Summary of Progress Report, which will be presented later this spring. And with that, I am happy to answer any questions that board members may have.
The MDE guidelines,
Yes.
how are they compared to federal guidelines or other state guidelines, and how were they developed?
Looking at our architect on those, I don't know if you have any sense to that at all?
Are they arbitrary? Are they based upon, what are they based upon?
They are adopted by the Department of Education, and they are put together by local representatives. They can't state who is on that group and how often those guidelines are adjusted, but when there are trends or needs that happen within education, those are addressed and, in whatever cycle they are to be addressed. In regards to your question on federal guidelines, I'm not aware of a federal guideline. All of the space standards happen at the state level, to my understanding. We practice in multiple regions, and the guidelines are different in different regions. And so as we practice in the state of Minnesota, we adhere to the MDE guidelines here.
And those are based on a square footage?
Right.
Square footage
For each of
calculation.
But we don't know how that compares against any other state.
I don't at this time, but I'm happy to look into that and provide some information if you'd like.
And we all know that Media Center has changed dramatically over the last 15 or 20 years. And when did they change their guidelines on Media Center, since one of the objects?
So guidelines for the media centers have been around and similar, I'd say, for probably the last 10 years. But I'd like to also share that it's not a hardline criteria or something that you need to adhere to in regards to a square footage requirement. It is a guideline, so that as we practice, or most school districts look at what their definition of a media center is and what they'd like to offer. And the guideline is just to kind of a litmus test in regards to, are we at or around that square footage to offer general common practices in the media center. Some are more book intense, some are more technology intense, and each community kind of chooses where they land in that pendulum and what they'd like to offer and what their definition of a media center is.
And you did put the square footage guidelines and the specific under or overage for the high schools in there.
We did, and it's a
I can't
range.
recall what that is.
It's a range.
Okay.
How have we engaged our families who have been impacted the last couple of years? Even the conversation around potential boundary changes have caused a lot of angst in families, and there's been a lot of work, of course, going into ECMAC, and I appreciate the time that our parents have put in and our schools and staff, but because there's been different iterations with different data we've received, I'm just curious about what communication kind of engagement have kept people kind of up to date on it, especially the people that have, in the families and communities that have been impacted by the conversation around it.
Sure. I can say specifically over the last year, so last spring when the pause happened and when there were some specific options that we were considering at that time, we did go out to some of those schools, PTO meetings that were highly attended, and had kind of an open forum question and answer, where we're at with our process, what some of the options that we're considering, what the impact potentially could be. As far as the work this fall, that hasn't happened yet. That will be part of the Oversight Task Force process, is understanding how do we reach out to those communities that are impacted, or depending on what those options that come out of that Oversight Task Force, what's the best way to communicate that. So we will be putting together a comprehensive communication plan for that.
I think every meeting we've had in the last 3 years regarding this has been televised.
Yep.
Not just
Correct.
a work session, it's been audio taped,
That's
so
correct. Yep.
that's just for the broader community.
I have a question. When we talk about our next steps and we want to start to understand the undercapacity conditions and facility needs for specialized programs, does that take into consideration a number of our students who are in 287 and their specialized learning needs, and the potential to bring those students back into our district? Is that part of that, or has that not been considered?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're working on right now, and again, that work will start later this month with ECMAC, but the role of ECMAC is really to look at enrollment and capacity. And so what is affecting, or what could affect our capacity in our buildings, and then how does enrollment engage with that? But we know that we do have some of these specialized program needs as well. And so typically those are decisions in terms of where do we place those specialized programs in our buildings. Those are decisions that are made by staff and administration. But we also know that it could have an impact on some of the capacities at our school. So that is why ECMAC is going to engage in terms of learning about some of those things. But ultimately, those are decisions that our administrative staff will be making in terms of where are our needs and where's the best place to place some of those programs. And so some of the things that I know Kate Emmons is working on with our assistant superintendents is what are some of those needs, what are some of those opportunities for potentially maybe taking some of those students back, and what is the best way to serve them within our school district, including our facilities. So.
Right, yes, so I'm glad to hear that that's something that will be talked about, because a lot of these kids in these programs are in 1-to-1 or 3-to-1 programs, and so the capacity is significantly different for their needs than a standard classroom setting would be. So I just want to make sure that we're really making sure we pay attention to those specialized needs when we're moving forward with that, so thank you.
In the projection numbers, programming was considered in that number, right? So if there was.
Correct.
a
Current
certain number-
programming.
Yeah, current
Yep,
programming.
correct.
So that classroom, the need was set aside in the projections.
So essentially, when we figure out the capacity calculation for each, we're looking at those base assumptions, and then we're also looking at where are some of our specialized programs already, where are they existing, where is it best, and then we're essentially taking those offline, those classrooms offline, so they're not calculated in our capacity calculation. But we know there's still some additional needs that we have, and those are the things that we're working closely with Kate and her team to understand what those are, and what is the best place for them from a facility standpoint.
New programs such as expanded CTE or language programs, that's in next generation learning, or would that,
Yes.
okay.
Yep, so that's in next
Okay, I'll hold my
generation
question
learning, knowing that
Oh, go
that
ahead.
potentially could impact our capacity.
Right.
Depending on what some of those decisions are, so, yep.
And that was something with ECMAC committee wrestled with, was that this is purely with the assumption that we're just talking about capacity, not programming changes. And so when we do that work to look at the undercapacity, either if we change something with new or different magnet schools with that excess capacity that could draw students and provide relief in a different way, but that was not within the scope of the ECMAC work.
No,
I would say, though, I think that's certainly why the pause and the alignment with a comprehensive approach was so important, is to make sure that we were having some of those conversations about where's some of those programs best to be housed, so that knowing that it will affect our capacity potentially at some of our buildings, and then we can make plans based on that, so.
So like expansion of a STEM program, a magnet program at Weaver Lake, that's not baked into here. We could offer 300 more kids, 50% greater, but that's not in here, and that would potentially change the recommendation.
If that was the programming decision,
Right.
then ECMAC would have to determine from there what would the observations and recommendations be based on that programming decision.
Okay.
So the ECMAC recommendations, I mean, going way back, Basswood's really like off the table, right? The one
Correct.
original.
Yep.
Garden City is not necessarily being considered. So the two considerations for the elementary level are the Rice Lake addition and then the new elementary school
Correct.
option. So
Yep.
those are the two options that we're moving forward to.
Those are the two that ECMAC has recommended.
That would be
forward.
moving for, that they would
To the
recommend moving
oversight
forward to the
task force.
oversight task force.
Yep.
With a strong monitor on Garden City.
Correct. We had a lot of conversation about Garden City, because as you see, while they are projected to be over capacity, it's within kind of that 10% threshold, which is what ECMAC has traditionally used. And so ECMAC did not feel comfortable in adding that as part of the recommendation to do something now, but there was strong belief that we needed to continue to monitor that very closely in case a trend started or something kind of additional growth happened that would necessitate some capacity relief.
I have another question. How do you increase cafeteria space, like in a school that already?
There's multiple ways, and if I can ask Lene actually to speak to that, there is certainly multiple ways that we can do it, through a renovation, through an addition. I don't know if there's specific things that you want to talk to. I think it depends on the building as well. So.
It does. It depends on the building. And so some of your cafeterias are landlocked in the middle of the building, and some have some exterior exposure. So there's a comprehensive look at the facility itself, and then also talking to your administrators at that building in regards to if you need to expand a cafeteria that might be landlocked in the middle of the building. And we actually had some of those conversations today as we this week as we walked through facilities. If we were to expand this way, what does that mean for the programming? Where does it need to go? Where's the right home for that programming? And so, and it's not always an obvious solution to expand on a building to the outside. There might be some internal opportunities in regards to some of the things that you might hear about today in regards to programming changes or locker commons availability or that type of thing. So very much a comprehensive look at the facility and the campus as a whole. Does that answer your question?
I have a question. When we're talking about the recommendation to expand cafeteria sizes at our high schools, was open campus lunch considered?
So I'm sorry.
Open campus lunch?
Yeah,
for our high schools?
again, we didn't, ECMAC's was simply to look at what is the current enrollment capacity. So capacity meaning if we were operating according to all of our base assumptions, what are our recommendations? So that would be not
That'd be
necessarily
like
a
a program
programming,
change.
but it is more along the lines of something that's out of the scope of ECMAC's role.
Okay, thanks.
I imagine that might bring up a whole host of safety concerns. Yes.
Well, I'm
It's
not
a whole
saying-
different
I'm not
day.
saying it wouldn't, I just wanted
No, I
to know
know,
if it
I
had been
understand.
discussed as part of the solution.
I can
Yep.
just see the safety people going. The school people.
Okay, board members, any additional questions here on ECMAC? There'll be an opportunity at the end here as well, so you may still be thinking of some things. But I'll keep things moving here. Thank you, Ron. So I'll hand it over to our team on Next Generation Learning Spaces. We'll pass the clicker over here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. All right, good evening, Chair Ostafi, school board members, Superintendent McIntyre. I'm excited to kick off our sharing of all the work that's been done over the last almost 2 years now around Next Generation Learning Spaces. So I'm going to kick off the elementary portion of that. During the 17-18 and into the 18-19 school year, an instructional facilities study team made up of district leaders, including assistant superintendents, executive directors, and coordinators, met in response to ECMAC's recommendations and the need to address curriculum initiatives and delivery. The team outlined a set of guiding principles and design criteria to be used by stakeholder teams to develop recommendations for next generation. Thank you. For next generation learning spaces. This information can be found on pages 7 and 8 of your Next Generation Learning Spaces School Board Report document. A project plan was completed and 3 stakeholder study teams were formed. The purpose of the elementary and secondary Next Generation Learning Spaces teams is to provide input in order to develop recommendations for next generation learning spaces to guide the addition or renovation of future instructional spaces in the district schools. Last spring, the elementary Next Generation Learning Spaces study team was formed involving site leaders, teachers, and district staff. The elementary team began by reading information on Next Generation Learning Spaces in May. The team toured other schools, both renovated and new. They debriefed the visits by describing, interpreting, and generalizing what they saw and applying their learning to what we want to see in our schools. They then developed draft recommendations to be shared with elementary building leaders and DPAC for feedback in December. More detailed information of the elementary study team and process can be found on pages 14 through 31 of the school board report document referenced on the last slide. Final recommendations in detail can also be found on pages 2 and 3 of the same document. Well, we had the opportunity to start off by touring 3 different schools, 2 brand new schools, and 1 third building as an older building that was renovated as part of their building to reflect next generation learning. This slide and slides that follow show you some of these things that we saw during our tours. These pictures are from Centerview Elementary in Spring Lake Park. You can see they used movable glass walls to create flexible spaces that were used for full group, small group, and individual instruction. Giving student choice in choosing from a variety of furniture was a key element in all the schools we toured. You can see examples of soft furniture, rocking stools, and chairs of varying heights, as well as tables on wheels, so that it is easy to move and change the classroom setup for direct instruction, small groups, and individual work. Many classrooms at all 3 schools toured have glass walls or windows to make learning more visible. You can see on the picture on the left, that's more of it's a window. There's no movable or flexibility in that window, but it provides that line of sight, because outside of that is another flexible area where students can go to work collaboratively while the teacher has a good line of sight. And the picture on the right has those walls that are glass, and that can be opened and shut. And we did see during the tours a lot of flexibility in, amongst the different grade levels. Some had them wide open, some had them partially open, some had them totally closed. So it was really about how the teams work together. So it did provide some flexibility in how they wanted to organize according to their grade levels. Hallways are designed to be a collaborative learning space, which we saw as a common theme during our tours. And again, you can see it in these 2 pictures. The one on the right are your common hallways that provided more space and more collab areas. And the one on the left is a classroom with a space outside of the classroom that allowed for collab spaces. Security is addressed in multiple ways. As you can see from the picture shown here, Centerview Elementary is designed to have grade level pods divided by grade level entries. Northwoods Elementary is able to close off areas of the media center by bringing down garage door-like glass walls that specific areas cannot be accessed during community events. Calming spaces with adjustable lighting were seen in 2 of the schools. An example of a calming room with the control panel can be seen here. And what we saw in these rooms is they can adjust the lighting in those rooms based on student choice. Different students respond to different lighting, whether it's brighter or darker or different colors. So this control panel allows for some flexibility on what kind of space you want to create for individualized students. Flexibility is demonstrated in multi-purpose common areas. As seen here, Centerview Elementary has designed their cafeteria and media center to serve multiple purposes, providing flexibility in how these spaces can be used day to day. The picture on the last page. There you go. Picture on the right is their cafeteria, and it's actually their main entrance area. So in the right corner, that's where they go into the office to check in. But it then provides, they use the space for a variety of things. And then the picture on the left is their media center. It's a 2-level media center, which they have a presentation area down below and a lot of their books up above. Media centers are designed to facilitate collaboration and use of technology. All 3 schools toured have designed their media center spaces to reflect next generation learning, providing flexibility space for student, staff, and community collaboration. We had a lot of feedback from both elementary principal groups and DPAC. On this slide are some of the major themes that emerged in their discussions. These were considered by the elementary study team, and the final recommendations were refined based on some of this feedback, along with what we had learned through our readings and tours. Highlighting a few items from above, both groups shared the importance of professional development, flexible furniture and spaces, and inclusivity of the community. Moving on to our other recommendations, under renovations and additions, we recommend renovating media centers into next generation learning hubs. We also recommend designing and implementing flexible learning spaces throughout the elementary school to facilitate personalized student-centered learning. We recommend redesigning cafeteria spaces with more flexible seating options and student work areas to create multi-purpose space. We recommend ensuring adequate gym space large enough for assemblies and possible alternative gym space for physical education classes, like a cafe gym auditorium with pull-down seating. We recommend replacing walls where appropriate with glass movable walls for learning on display and collaboration spaces. This would include glass walls and windows, collaborative spaces outside of classrooms, open doors and windows, also all providing the necessary line of sight for supervision. We also recommend including inclusive spaces when renovating, adding, or creating space. For example, inclusive bathrooms, calming spaces, private rooms for nursing and prayer, handicap accessibility, signage in different languages or symbols for a universal language and movement to benefit and provide access for students, staff, and community members. We recommend designing common spaces with the community in mind and with community input. We recommend considering including outdoor learning spaces at elementary schools as part of the renovation where appropriate. And we recommend considering specialized programming such as magnet programming and early childhood programming when designing renovations and additions. Under the area of furniture, fixtures, and equipment, we recommend implementing a flexible furniture standard for learning spaces such as classrooms, media centers, cafeterias, and other spaces that includes furniture that allows for student choice and can be arranged in multiple ways: high tops, rolling chairs, and rolling chairs with desks attached, tables, wobble stools, soft seating, etc. We recommend upgrading learning spaces and teacher collaborative space to have 21st century technology and welcoming aesthetics, such as lights, interactive panels, outlets, and simplified technology, teaching technology, Wi-Fi, sound systems, sound control, acoustical panels, and natural or filtered lighting where possible. Under the area of professional development, we recommend implementing professional development and ongoing support for teachers about the use of next generation learning spaces and the pedagogy that supports building a new learning climate and culture in new spaces. We recommend continuing professional development focus on personalized learning, which is path, place, and pace, And we recommend preparing teachers to use new spaces, furniture, and technology. And wrapping it up, we further recommend taking the 2020-21 school year to assess our elementary schools in order to determine the extent that schools have implemented the next generation learning spaces elements and determine where additional investments are needed. I now like to turn it over to Kelly and Steve to share the secondary next generation learning spaces information.
Good evening. I'm going to talk about the process we utilize for the secondary leadership team and study team. Please note that in your packet, Appendix N, which is on page 32, has a complete list of the team members from both teams, and then Appendices P and Q on pages 34 and 35 will provide you the detailed timeline for our process. So last spring, the assistant superintendents, along with Kim Riesgraff, started meeting with all secondary building principals and then select DLTL directors to develop recommendations for next generation learning spaces in order to guide the addition or renovation of future instructional spaces in our district secondary schools. This next generation learning spaces leadership team has continued to meet throughout this year as well. And then in addition, in September of this current school year, we also created a next generation learning spaces study team. And that study team included 2 site leaders, it included numerous teachers, and then some district staff. And this team was really to be an advisory group that was to provide input in order to develop recommendations for the next generation learning spaces. So they then provided input that went back to the leadership team. So we had 2 teams running simultaneously, as you can see in the picture. We had a secondary leadership team and a secondary study team. Both the leadership team and the study team researched information on next generation learning spaces, and they also visited other schools that had adopted flexible learning spaces. The teams then debriefed their findings from both the research and from the tours, and they described, interpreted, generalized, and applied those findings to our schools. And you can see more of that work in its entirety in Appendix R, which is on page 36 of your board report. After researching and visiting the sites, the study team developed rough draft recommendations on next generation learning spaces that were then shared with the leadership team. And that work is outlined on page 39, Appendix S. The leadership team then provided both input and feedback on the recommendations back to the study team. The study team worked with those recommendations and then brought the recommendations forward to DPAC, which is our District Planning Advisory Council. And they brought it to DPAC for feedback. And then based on that feedback, we developed the final recommendations, the study team did, on December 18th. The final recommendations, by the way, can be found on page 4 in your report.
As part of our secondary process that Kelly mentioned, we toured 3 secondary schools. 2 schools were remodeled to incorporate the new flex learning space, and the third, a newer high school building that had a recent expansion that allowed the district to incorporate many of the flex spaces that we were interested in for our next generation learning. This slide and the slides that follow show some of the spaces and furniture that we encountered on our tours. The pictures on the following slides are from Bloomington's Jefferson High School, Edina Middle School, and Shakopee High School. Wald Architect assisted us in identifying schools and school leaders who were in the early stages and or several years into the process of flex space development. In both photos, you can see Jefferson had flex space exterior to their media center to create spaces for full or small group, also individual and collaboration space to support instruction. Both students and teachers register for access to this space, or teachers may assign students to report there when absent, so removing the need for a substitute. Here's an example of an updated media center at Edina Middle School, which has been repurposed to accommodate multiple groups for both teacher-led and student-led instruction. The picture on the right illustrates a small learning circle and a presentation theater seating, so it can serve as a fishbowl for presentations by teachers and students. The photo on the left shows how small group seating has been integrated into the hallways with cafe-style seating for students to pair up. Again, at Jefferson, they had adapted the media center to incorporate a classroom for multiple purposes. When we visited, students were utilizing a 3D printer located in the media center, just outside the classroom. So now drawing your attention, around the corner is the Career Resource Center, which utilizes learning on display, which indicated by the glass walls. And to essentially, as you can see, make that center accessible and pretty welcoming to all students. Here is a great example of flex space that incorporates learning on display. This space has direct access to the media center via the door in the back. And notice, if you can, on the left, the teacher station. It's mobile. Back to Edina Middle School, as we saw, there were a number of flex spaces that were located throughout the building. And within some of the flex spaces, you can see were additional spaces offering a mini classroom or a collaboration space. Here, students could break off and have a sound barrier between them and the other flex space, between them and the larger flex space. So as you can see this photo on the right, we actually interrupted them, but a group of students were working on a self-directed project. I also want to kind of draw your attention to the various seating options that are available throughout that space and the other spaces as well. Moving on to Shakopee High School. As part of their expansion in 2018, Shakopee created academies. The academies are smaller learning communities of students and teachers who are organized around areas of interest. And so the spaces you see here on the slide is actually the Engineering and Manufacturing Academy. Students are in a hands-on in one of the space with easy access to the adjoining equipment. Notice in the bottom photo, the tables used to facilitate collaboration and the amount of technology. And I would also like to draw your attention to note the visibility that is offered between the spaces with the use of glass. Staying with Shakopee High School, here are some more examples of dedicated and open space utilized to support collaboration and presentations. The photo on the left is what they call the Shark Tank. This space is located in the tech help area, just like the TV show. Students are able to present both to other students or to their corporate partners. The photo on the right is a good illustration of how several districts have invested in creating large, open, flexible spaces to help create a sense of community and open meeting space. So again, that photo on the right illustrates how the cafeteria area has been integrated with the stepatorium, which serves both as a gathering space and a place to connect to other services, like the student-led bank, which was very cool to see. It is not uncommon for lectures or for fine arts performances to be hosted in that space. And also note, again, the steps lead up to a larger undedicated flex space situated on the second floor. This doubles also as auditorium seating for some of those mini performances that I mentioned. So utilizing all the space in the building was a big interest of our teams. So utilizing existing space like we have seen at Jefferson and Edina Middle School are good examples of potential modifications to existing space. In these photos above, however, you can see how new construction help hallways become those inviting spaces for students by offering comfortable seating arrangements, that really stimulate learning and collaboration. And so we had an opportunity to walk around and speak with the kids and just ask them how they like the space. And so at varying degrees, they were utilizing it, we saw throughout, and appreciated it. So now I'm going to hand this back to Kelly, who's going to discuss feedback and the team's recommendations.
So the next step in our process then was to gain feedback from the secondary leadership team and the DPAC group, as I mentioned earlier. So we had a lot of feedback from both groups, and on this slide are some of the more emerging themes that surfaced in our discussions. But you will want to note that the secondary leadership team feedback in its entirety can be found in Appendix T on page 41, and the DPAC feedback in its entirety can be found in Appendix L on page 25. But let's start with the emerging themes with the secondary leadership team. So the secondary leadership team's feedback was that we start with the media centers, that we address career and technical education at the senior highs, that we extend our current timeline in order to provide for additional time for deep study, planning, and developing CTE programming across the district. And their feedback was also that we focus on professional learning that supports the 21st century learning spaces. It's critical. You cannot have one without the other. The DPAC feedback was that they were very excited about the multi-purpose spaces and flexible seating, and they really liked the look of the modern facilities. They believe that this work demonstrates our district's commitment to community and to the student learning environments. They requested that safety and security be considered where learning is on display, for example, the glass walls, and they're excited that the spaces will mirror college environments. They believe that that will better prepare our students for moving beyond the high school secondary experience. So after gathering the feedback from all the groups, we're ready to make some recommendations. So we're going to start with renovations and additions. Our recommendation is that we renovate the media centers into next generation learning hubs. We recommend renovating the hallways to make multiple common areas by removing unnecessary locker banks where appropriate and opening things up for more of a college feel. And you really saw a good example of that in that last Shakopee High School picture. We recommend redesigning the cafeteria spaces with more flexible seating options and student work areas that then create more of a multi-purpose space. Continuing with our renovations and additions, we recommend completing the renovations or additions for specialized career and technical education programming in each of the 3 comprehensive high schools. Yet we also need more time to further determine those options for each of the high schools. We want to really make the best decisions for each of those buildings, and that's going to take some time. We recommend including student voice throughout the design and the selection process, and replacing walls where appropriate with glass movable walls for learning on display and collaboration. And again, in the pictures, you saw some examples of those glass walls and windows. You saw where there were those collaborative spaces outside of the classrooms. And really the key is that we always keep in mind that there has to be a line of supervision from staff to the students. That was something that came up as feedback from every group. In terms of furniture, fixtures, and equipment, we recommend implementing a flexible furniture standard for learning spaces. And learning spaces, again, are not just, if you recall, confined to the classrooms. We're really looking at classrooms, we're looking at media centers, we're looking at cafeterias, and we're looking at other spaces. So we want a furniture standard for those learning spaces that includes furniture that will allow for student choice, student flexibility, and multi-purpose use. And when we say student choice, we really mean student choice around their own learning. So if I work better with a quiet focus, then I can move my chair, if I have a rolling chair or a rolling desk, over to this area. If I work better with a collaborative group, then again, those rolling chairs or rolling chairs with desks attached can be moved. We're also talking about things such as the high top chairs. You saw some of those. We're talking about soft seating. You saw a lot of that. You saw in those pictures some of the tiered seating where there may be almost like an amphitheater, and then it kind of goes up and there's stools behind it. And then you saw the stepatorium that was also in Shakopee, and that's also a place for students to gather and learn. So there's all sorts of things that I know our schools were really excited about. And then we also are recommending that we upgrade the learning spaces to have 21st century technology to support technology needs. And that goes back to that lighting, the adaptable lighting you saw with Patrick's piece. Obviously Wi-Fi and student voice systems in our classrooms and sound systems.
So the study team also strongly recommended really the following around learning culture. And we saw all the different pieces to the flexible learning, but it was the sentiment was very strong about we need to make sure that the culture shifts to support this. So what that means is implementing a common language around next generation learning spaces, teaching practices, and classroom expectations. And we saw various aspects of that. And that's where we really saw the leaders in various buildings show up, as well as the staff. And again, creating a culture where students are seekers of knowledge in collaborative ways and are at the center of their own learning. The study team is recommending that focus on personalized learning. We saw examples of that: seminar, groups, teacher-directed, independent collaborative work, all those types of instructional modalities supported by flexible furniture. You heard about this from the elementary group, but the focusing on professional development for teachers and how to really use that space and really how to build that pedagogy around personalized learning was a strong recommendation from the study team. Developing that common, again, that common language and professional development. And it really spoke to the transformational potential that I think the study team saw in this flexible learning approach. Again, to double down on our professional development, on personalized learning, path, place, and pace, making sure that we're training teachers to be facilitators of learning, and then also to explicitly teach students how to flex in and out of these spaces. And again, we saw examples of that where that was deliberately taught, and students could then talk about their learning and how these spaces informed and supported that learning. Now I'm going to turn this back over to Kelly.
So after considering the feedback from DPAC and then the Next Generation Learning Spaces study team, our leadership team, and then after developing the recommendations specifically around renovations and additions, furniture, fixture, and equipment, and learning culture, we arrived at some final overall recommendations for our work in the secondary schools. The first one is that we are recommending that we take the entire 2020-2021 school year to assess the status of next generation learning spaces in our secondary schools, to determine where there's gaps, and then to propose changes where we have those gaps or where we don't have gaps. So we need to really get out and spend a lot of time in the buildings. We've talked about myself, Patrick, Steve, and Ron, and probably Dale, going out to every one of those secondary buildings and really looking at it with a whole different lens in terms of renovations and additions, furniture, fixture, and equipment, and then the learning culture. So that takes time. That's going to take some time to do a really in-depth analysis of the buildings. And then we also recommend, as I spoke to earlier, including student voice at multiple points in the design and selection process. That was really important for the leadership team, the study team, and our DPAC group. And again, this is just a last reminder that the final recommendations begin on page 4 of your Next Generation Learning Spaces Board report. But with that, that completes our formal presentation, so I would like to open it up for questions.
And board members, before you jump in, I just wanted to again thank Kim Reesgraff for her involvement in this process.
Yes, we certainly do.
Kim's had a very long, successful career and probably has done every job in our system over the years.
Kim, you're like a bad penny.
Good penny.
Good penny.
Good bad penny.
Thank you.
Seriously, her leadership and contributions to this particular body of work with elementary and secondary was wonderful. And then I just lastly need to say thank you again to all the team members that were on the leadership or study teams that were a part of this process. So with that, I'll open it back up. Sorry.
Okay, so I was going to say all the thank yous too, so I don't have to do that part. Thanks. But I just wanted to outline a couple of things. I serve on DPAC, and for board members, in the packet that we received, this information is already in there, but for anybody viewing, I also wanted to share that the secondary, for DPAC, the secondary recommendations were the feedback. One thing that was really important, I actually also received emails afterwards about that, about making sure that our spaces at the secondary level are inclusive, and that was really broad spectrum. They were talking about inclusive when we're talking about neurodiversity, cultural diversity, and physical abilities. And I think that all of the recommendations really lead to that final outcome, but I just wanted to make sure that I outlined it, especially because I did receive communication about that. And I appreciate all the work that you have put into this, and I would like a quicker timeline, but I know that it takes time to figure these things out, but it's really exciting work, and I think it will really benefit our students.
Thank you.
I was just curious about the Shakopee High School, the Career Academy focus. Like, what were the different programs within that they had?
Yeah, I Googled it, so yeah.
Okay.
I think they have 9.
Yeah, I think it's,
Do
so they
9
have
academies.
Arts and Communication Academy, the Business and Entrepreneurship. We mentioned we visited the Engineering and Manufacturing. We actually visited many of them. The Health Science Academy,
Culinary.
Human Services, Science and Technology, and Freshman Academy. I think the culinary falls under the Business and Entrepreneurship, which was, we went with the, like I said, we had the principals there, and I haven't seen Heather Miller Sink so excited.
I might tip your hands of the CTE program at Park Center.
Is she here?
No.
Okay. So, yeah, those were the various academies, and, as part of the expansion, so we're looking at that. So when they expanded built in 2018, they moved to this academy model.
And I know that other districts, and one I used to work in has a medical careers academy, so it really can be developed based on what our needs or desires are in our system.
And they all the freshmen, when they enter, are in the freshman academy, and in the course of that year then is when they start to develop different interest areas that then determine what academy they attend 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. So in the 9th grade academy, they really get a taste of all of them, and maybe it can further refine where they want to study after that. Cool. It was very cool.
Does that lock you into a pathway in 10th grade, or does that allow you to be flexible in your learning across all the generals or all the academies?
Yeah, I'm not 100% on that, Mike, but I think from what I recall, there was flexibility both in the freshman approach, but also I think there's flexibility built throughout.
From what I learned, there's
yeah.
flexibility because they all have the core subject areas in each one of the academies, so they're taking the core subject areas anyway, and the other classes would serve as their electives, so that would certainly give them the opportunity to go into a different academy as a junior, because they wouldn't be missing anything they needed for graduation.
Well, I have a few questions, as you can imagine. Just background, the school that I teach in has had flexible learning spaces since 2012, and we've learned a lot in our last 8 years. So one of my questions is, how long of the schools that you visited had these flexible learning spaces, and did they give you any feedback on what they would change if they were going to be able to do it again?
Sure, yeah. I believe Edina was, I think, in their 3rd or 4th year. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? Shakopee, more recent, I think, with, obviously the newer building, and
the
then,
academies.
yeah, with the academies.
First
And Jefferson, I think, was about 2 years into their renovations and their changes. We did ask that question about what would you do different.
At both levels?
Yeah, elementary, the 2 of the schools were brand-new schools. Just one opened this year, one opened last year. And the 3rd school, just the renovations, they were still in the process of renovating, but it was their first year of opening the school new year with some renovations done. So too early to really tell the direct impact and learnings, but
Well, I know where you could ask some questions.
we did learn at one of the elementary schools, it was brand new, when you put those windows in that have little cubicles for the kids to go in, put something on the window so that people aren't trying to go through the window thinking it's not there. So
Right.
things like that, learning proper space of windows and avoiding, it's called risk management.
And body space awareness for
Yeah,
young
you
people.
appreciate that.
And I would say too, some of the deliberate planning, the more time to plan, to make, to really sort of build that buy-in was a theme that we heard. And also, in a couple of the schools, again, was sort of, and I think we're heeding this, is to think about that safety aspect up front as you begin to design it.
Can I just
Go
ask
for it.
them to share something I think will help answer your question? Could you share about what you talked about in the DPAC meeting about how students or teachers are implementing the program, that you noticed a difference between
Yeah,
sites?
I was just going to talk about that. Thank you, Heather. So, for example, Edina Southview Middle School is probably our best example of that. When we went to Edina Southview Middle School, even though they did the same changes at the other middle school, it was all about the training and really the leadership in that building, because the leader in that building was fully immersed in the use of flexible learning spaces in order to improve student learning and student achievement. And so it was very, very intentional about the teaching to the staff on how to use those spaces and the professional development around that, and the teaching specifically to the students. There was not one student that we saw at Southview Middle School that could not speak about their own learning. We were amazed. Michael, you were out there, remember that? We were amazed because they could say, oh, this is my quiet focus time. So I'm going over to this learning space because I need quiet focus time. Well, what are you doing during quiet focus time? Could tell you exactly what they were doing. Or we're going over here because this is our collaborative group time and we're working on a project-based, you name it, whatever it was. But they could identify their learning and they put themselves at the center of their learning. And then they said, now the rest of the class over there, they're having teacher-led instruction. And the teacher is teaching about this. What we saw that was amazing to us when we were at Edina was they taught to how to use those spaces, and that's something that really resounded with us. And in fact, the research that we have about these spaces, about flexible learning spaces, and what do they do in terms of student achievement, it flat out says, it's not going to impact anything if you don't specifically train around the use of those learning spaces, and if there's not consistency in the implementation. Then other than that, it's just another strategy, right? And we saw that, Sarah, you were there too, we saw that a lot at Edina. When we were at Spring Lake Park, for example, the high school, they had tons and tons of flexible learning spaces, but they're more preparing for the kids that they see that they believe are coming down the road. And so we saw a lot of really empty areas, and and we could tell that the staff hadn't specifically been trained in how to use those spaces. So that was our key takeaway. Key takeaway is we have to train the staff and the students in how to use those learning spaces.
My suggestion on that piece is also make sure that when you're talking about using those spaces, also talk about build some staff team building, especially at the elementary level, if you're going to do any kind of collaborative teaching. At the school that I work in, we have 4 or 5 teachers in one bigger room that's more like a media center with break-off rooms. And we've had successful experiences where the team gelled and unsuccessful where the team didn't gel. And I believe that a more purposeful, training, working with that, as well as working with the furniture and the pedagogy that works best for that. Another question I have is, did you get any questions or thoughts on kids with trauma and flexible learning spaces and how that is helpful or not helpful? I understand that lighting would be very helpful. I understand that. And choice of color.
Yeah.
That's another suggestion.
And having the calming
Yeah.
spaces and other things.
Yeah,
and-
we
and
had
then-
bright green in one of ours.
Doesn't work.
No, lime green did not help.
And a lot of those pieces too, when you're creating different spaces, you're working with your internal team, like your IEP team, and what spaces in the building that are gonna be beneficial for that particular student. And so that's gonna be all part of their individualized plan. So if there's calming space that the student can use, you're gonna utilize that and what's best in that environment based on color, location. We also talked about, in some of these learning on display, you think about what else are you gonna see? If you have visitors coming through the school, and
Right.
what are some things you're gonna see? And so there has to be a deliberate plan in your school based on individual students or groups that you have to account for when you're making these spaces available. So those are definitely discussions that we've had and asked about and would continue to have as we plan for part of that professional development too, when we talk to staff about how to use the new space.
I will have more questions later because I don't want to take forever on here. Just two more questions on the broader space is, how are we planning on engaging the community in learning about flexible learning spaces? In our study that we did, I think there's a lot of families that think it's a good idea but have no idea what it really is. And then related to that, when we, well, it's a totally different question, but in our long-term facilities management, how can we plan for the possibility of flex learning if we're taking an entire year and a half to do more studies of what we need, which I think is an important plan, because we don't do what my school did and do some stuff and then find out a lot of stuff that you should have done differently.
I think that's a great question. The value of having the recommendations that are coming forth and that the Oversight Task Force will be looking at is funding mechanisms. And obviously, we have a plan in place for our long-term facility maintenance, and part of that is renovating different spaces. And so we can start to implement some of these recommendations in the work that we already have planned. And so as we go out and we look at each of these schools, some of the schools that we're going to be looking at is schools that we have on tap for next summer. And so we will have that as we plan for that long-term facility maintenance work for next summer to start to implement some of these
And Dale was
recommendations.
conscripted on some of those teams too.
Yes,
So.
yes, he was in those.
And I know that part of the
Study
work
teams.
of the Oversight Task Force, there's two pieces. And if you look at back at the chart we originally got, there's two pieces, and both of those involve public feedback and bringing things out to the public and then getting their feedback. So we're hoping that, we'll get a lot of family feedback that way. Jackie, for your first question,
Which will also need to involve education as well.
absolutely. And, and I'm also envisioning at the schools themselves, as we get further down the road and know what it will look like at each specific school, that, at one of their parent meetings or something like that, they'll also say, here's what you can anticipate at Osseo Middle School, for example, and then kind of, go through that. When we were doing the grade reconfiguration, I was at Park Center at the time, and I know that we did that so they could see what will this look like. So
Yeah, another example
those
is, I know
opportunities.
Michael, Principal Lehan, during learning conferences, is that what you call them, at the high school, would have some of the sessions in that new learning space that they have, strategically, right? To see the space and to be able to talk about the space and how it's used. So that's part of that education that we can provide our families when we start having some of these spaces created. Strategically use different opportunities that we bring community in to be able to experience the space and teach them how we're using the space.
Yeah, definitely to capitalize on that, or the space now at Park Center as well.
I just think this is really fascinating and exciting, and I think that throughout the district we've had a little taste of all of this. I think about like Basswood and things that, and Patrick, when you were there implementing like the wobble stools that the students get to sit on, and I mean I think children or the students and the families and the teachers really adapt really well to that. So it is really exciting. And then I think about some of the recommendations and the feedback, even the expanding the special ICT programs that we have already, like at Osseo, what does that look like with the health program? And then the thing that I think is really neat and an opportunity to really address some of the disparities is the CTE pathways from elementary through high school. I think that is just really important. And I think about, I go back to our solar the solar that's being installed in some of our elementary, and the opportunity for the teachers to have the programming there to talk to our students about career pathways and how do you kind of like, how do you start to leverage those investments that we're making and really impacting our students throughout their time and showing our students more opportunities for careers.
So, board members, I'm going to try to nudge us along a bit, but I want to come back to, I know there's more questions. I knew this would be an exciting topic for many of you.
So
And I've already warned my team, we're going to have follow-up questions beyond tonight. But I did want to highlight a piece. You heard that Kelly say, we need more time to, what I think of as inventory. What do we have, what do we need to have, and how do we prioritize that so we get really solid return on those investments and be cost smart about it? So yes, I share the same urgency, yet we need to do it thoughtfully, planfully, and use, part of this oversight task force role and moving into the future is funding sources, funding options, and how do we be planful about it. So as much as we would all love to bring that kind of detail to you, it really requires another phase of really digging into those details based on these concepts. So can I ask, unless there's another set of burning questions, we may have some time at the end or follow-up. Is that fair, or do you have some? Okay.
Well, for this one, I think the big burning question is, if we're going to undertake this and spend all this money, what are the expected measurable results in improved educational outcomes, the ability of more kids to come to our school, a higher capture rate because we have newer stuff and better things, and graduation rates. So, if we're going to spend tens of millions of dollars, which is what this is, what are we expecting to achieve for that rather than nice new fresh spaces?
You might have just answered your own question a little bit with the things you listed. I think are all the things we would want to be measuring around impact on this, whether it's our engagement work, whether it's capture rate. We would want to dial that in as far as what do we agree would be indicators of success for this.
Well, not just indicators of success, but if we're going to increase our enrollment by 5%, that's X amount of kids, that means millions of dollars in revenue. We can invest so much to do that.
Yeah, I was curious on that same vein if any of the schools you visited kind of had articulated measurable results in terms of changing outcomes. But again, I know there's a pathway and a time horizon to that when you're implementing something new. So I don't need an answer.
I can give you an answer if you want one.
Okay.
Well, so right now, honestly, this is all very new in a lot of schools, and any kind of change, what we heard over and over again, is going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight. RAND studies, research and development, the studies, there was one done in 2015, 2016, and 2017. And all of them show the same thing. It's a modest increase in student achievement, and it has to absolutely be implemented with fidelity, and there has to be a lot of professional training. Now, the last RAND study, the one that was done in 2017, showed that the math and reading test scores grew substantially compared with national averages. So that's very, very promising. The other piece that's very, very promising is that it seems to impact the lower achieving students even more. The lower achieving students are advancing even more quickly than their counterparts in non-flexible learning schools. But here's what I'll say, it's not going to be about the flexible learning spaces. It needs to be a collective set of strategies. It's going to be very hard to pull out that vein in terms of increasing student achievement. It is a collective set of strategies that we need to employ in our district. One of those certainly is looking at the next generation learning spaces. Another is always looking at our curriculum and the pedagogy. Another is always looking at the way that instruction is being delivered and the training of teachers. And then another is obviously looking at how students learn and what best meets and puts the students at the centers of their own learning. So when you think about it, the learning spaces, the physicality of that and the furniture is one piece in a number of pieces that, have to work in tandem in order to increase student achievement.
I can tell you that the U of M came to our building with our flexible learning and did a study and found higher engagement levels and higher academic scores. And I can also tell you in my own classroom, since I've implemented flexible learning, even though they're only 4-year-olds, their academic and engagement and self-regulation has increased anecdotally quite a
Yeah,
bit.
and I would just say some of the research that Kelly was talking about is that integration of the flexible learning spaces with our one-to-one technology and what that may or may not mean for 21st century skills, to support the kind of workplace skills that we want our students to have.
Anecdotally, could you just share what you shared with me at DPAC about the teachers who at first were not bought in?
Yes. So really interestingly enough, at every single building that we visited, the principals talk about, on display, they wanted to make sure that we talked to all the teachers that were the biggest naysayers about doing the next generation learning spaces, the flexible learning spaces, so that we could talk to them and see how they had done a complete 180 once they saw how it impacted their students. So things that they were worried about, such as having the glass walls and the distractions, never came to play. They said old news for students, weren't even paying attention to it. They talked about what you said, Jackie, about the studies being done in Columbia Heights, that the students were much more engaged in their own learning, that they were at the center of their own learning, that they felt they had choice, and that their learning model and style was really being honored. So if I'm more in individualized learning, I can take my rolling desk and I can go over there and I can do more individualized learning. If I work better in a collaborative team setting, I can go do collaborative learning. So we went and talked to the most against the next generation learning spaces teachers that you could find, and they are now the biggest proponents of it and the biggest advocates, and saying that it completely transformed their teaching and completely transformed, and that the students are, we also heard them talk about lowering of truancy numbers and things like that, kids skipping, because again, they're more in charge of their own learning, much more like a college. And so, yeah, the schools let us talk to those teachers and nothing but good things to say, so.
All right, continue to feed us the questions you have. You're going to think of more, I know you will. So with that being said, thank you to our Next Generation Learning teams and team members and leaders on that work. I really appreciate it. I'm going to transition over to our safety, our third of 4 areas tonight around safety and security. I'll hand it over to Ron.
Good evening again. In 2016, the school district established the Risk and Emergency Management Advisory Committee, or affectionately known as REMAC, which is a group of staff, community members, and local law enforcement that were tasked with giving feedback and recommendations to ensure that students, staff, and families felt safe and secure in each and all of our buildings. Our risk management department has worked closely with this committee to establish best practices, to develop training standards, and to design and implement safety and security upgrades to our sites. This fall, our risk management department and our REMAC group engaged in studying specific safety and security facility needs that the district has as part of the integrated facilities planning process. So this evening, Troy Schreifels, our Director of Facilities and Transportation Operations, and Dave Mordock, our Coordinator of Risk Management, will walk the board through the findings and the recommendations they propose for the Oversight Task Force consideration. So with that, I'll turn it over to Troy.
Good evening, Chair Ostafi, school board members, and Superintendent McIntyre. If you thought next generation learning was exciting, wait till you hear about safety and security.
Don't steal our thunder.
Dave. Good luck, Dave,
Everybody
right?
take some deep breaths.
Here we go.
So excited.
This evening, Dave and I will share the work that we have done in risk management to build a better future for our schools. The purpose of the risk management department is to continually improve the district's emergency response plan, as well as security programs and initiatives we use in the district to help keep students, staff, and visitors safe. The focus of our presentation tonight will be on our findings and recommendations related to facility security needs. The process used by Risk Management Department was to review recommendations in nationally recognized reports, to include the Sandy Hook Commission report, the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas report, and the Federal Commission on School Safety report. This report was commissioned after the Parkland, Florida school shooting. It is unfortunate, but much can be learned by reviewing these tragic events to learn how events transpire, with the hope that measures can be put in place so these tragic events are never repeated. We also reviewed the PASS K-12 guidelines. PASS is comprised of experts from K-12 education, law enforcement, and the security industry with a singular focus on creating guidelines for implementing layered and tiered security in schools. Links to these reports can be found in your Risk Management Board report on the top of page 3. And I say links because these are hundreds of page documents for each report. We also toured other school districts to observe and learn what they are doing to keep students, staff, and visitors safe. This includes our neighbors to the north, Anoka Hennepin, as well as Rosemont, Apple Valley, Egan School District, and the Hastings Public Schools. After gathering information on best practices and assessing needs in the district, we engaged the Risk and Emergency Management Advisory Committee, affectionately known as REMAC. REMAC is comprised of over 40 members to include representation from almost every layer of the district. For example, building administrators, facilities, HR, teachers, and ESP union representation are just a few of the members in our group. We also have representatives from Brooklyn Park Police Department, Maple Grove Police Department, Osseo Police Department, as well as numerous parents and community members. A full list of our current REMAC membership can be found on page 9 in the Appendix A of your Risk Management Board packets. REMAC was established during the 2016-17 school year. Many of the findings and recommendations you will hear about tonight have been discussed and vetted through REMAC for several years. One highlight of REMAC's involvement in 2018 is the committee members conducted tours at a district elementary school, a middle school, and a high school to observe for themselves the current state of the facility security in our district. They also heard from building principals at each site to learn more about the security challenges they face on a day-to-day basis. A copy of the site tour checklist can be found on page 12 and 13 in Appendix C of your Risk Management Board report, and we had each of our members of our committee fill out that checklist and be able to observe in real life what was going on at a school at a given time. Risk Management then developed options for improvements, and REMAC provided comment and feedback. I will now turn it over to Dave, our District Coordinator of Risk Management, and he will share his findings with you.
Well, good evening, Chair Stoffe, Superintendent McIntyre, and board members. I'll now provide you with an overview of our risk management observations. Staff and students need a safe place in which to learn and to teach. For staff and students that live in a safe and secure environment, this is a continuation of what they're accustomed to. For staff and students that don't live in safe and secure environments, we want our schools to be that safe place for them. Schools can be both safe and secure and warm and welcoming. When we started this discussion with REMAC, we looked at these as competing values. When security is high, warm and welcoming is low, and vice versa. What we landed on is that we could develop systems that were both safe and secure and warm and welcoming. This work can be found in Appendix B and D on pages 11 and 14 of the Risk Management Board report. Our current reality is that we have inequities between schools and the level of security they provide. Some schools have controlled entrances that require visitors to speak to someone via intercom before they're let into the school, but most schools don't have this feature. Some schools have duress alarms that allows office staff to discreetly alert the police, but most schools do not. So why the inequities? Simply, funds are limited, and we have to implement security improvements in a phased approach. An example of this would be our recent grants that were awarded by MDE as part of their school safety grant. We had 4 schools that received over $500,000 in security improvements. Though we requested those same improvements for all of our schools, those were the 4 schools that were chosen. We identified 3 areas where schools do not meet current best practices or needs, and those areas are main entrance and our perimeter security, our camera system, and communications. A secure single point of entry is identified as a main entrance where we can control who enters the main office and also limit their access to the remainder of the school until they have been greeted by a staff member to determine the nature of their visit. We identified, and REMAC endorsed, 7 points that comprise of a 7 points that comprise of a single secure entry that meet the security principles of deter, detect, delay, and respond. I'll briefly discuss these 7 components. The first component is a vestibule intercom and door release. Visitors are greeted by intercom by staff before being let into the office. Number 2, laminated safety glass in the main entrance. Laminated safety glass is a delay mechanism if someone tries to force entry into the school. This provides staff time to alert police and to take protective measures. Number 3, new main entrance and main entrance vestibule cameras. It's important to clearly view people approaching the school. Number 4, the ability to lock down the main office to prevent an unwanted person from entering the school. If a person becomes hostile while in the main office, this lockdown feature seals off the main office from the rest of the school. The hostile person's only available path of exit is to leave the school. Number 5, strobe lights to alert itinerant staff, buses, and police and others that a school is in lockdown. Number 6, duress alarms that can be activated by front office staff to alert the police. And number 7, Raptor Visitor and Volunteer Management System to electronically log visitors and to screen for potential sex offenders and others restricted from gaining access to district locations. Some components of the single secure point of entry system have already been installed as funds have become available, but the need is still great in our district. The majority of our schools already have the correct main entrance layout for funneling visitors into the main office to facilitate a secure single point of entry. The exception would be our 3 comprehensive high schools that do not have the proper layout. For example, Maple Grove Senior and Osseo Senior would require some significant renovations to their main entrance due to their current atrium-style entrance. Park Center is unique in which it is the only site that utilizes 2 entrances during the school day. The south entrance is properly configured for a single secure point of entry, but the north entrance is not. The north entrance would require some remodeling, but not to the level of Maple Grove Senior and Osseo Senior. The main entrances also lack the proper protection from vehicles. The main entrances of schools are typical gathering places for students to wait for buses and parent pickup. We cannot focus our security improvements solely on the main entrance. We must also consider other doors that lead into the school and increase their security. It's important to note that we do not have an identified replacement cycle for these security improvements or funding for this equipment. Next, I will discuss our observations on our camera system. The district currently has over 1,200 cameras in the system. While almost all sites have some camera coverage, about 1/3 of the district has limited camera system. A limited in the sense that they do not cover the school adequately, in particular the perimeter and the doorways of the school. Secondary district locations such as parking lots and athletic facilities have the same camera needs. Cameras are force multipliers as they allow someone to view large areas of the school or property which would normally require numerous staff members moving about to do the same thing. Cameras also assist with crime prevention through environmental design, commonly referred to as CPTED, which is basically a concept of natural surveillance. People are less likely to commit unwanted behaviors if they believe they're being watched by someone else. Again, there's not an identified replacement cycle for cameras or funding for this equipment. Last, I would like to discuss communication. We have our day-to-day communication in school, as well as communication that we use in an emergency. Typically, two-way radios and public address systems are used for both. Two-way radios are the easiest and most reliable way for staff to communicate with site administration. The district currently has over 1,300 two-way radios on an aging analog radio system. When speaking with building leaders, our current system does not meet our needs. Radio reception is not always clear. There's no privacy for radio communications within the school. For example, if we have a student that's having a mental health crisis and we have 2 administrators that need to address that over a radio, others with a radio can overhear that conversation. And lastly, the district office here at the ESC, we cannot communicate with all of our schools via two-way radio. In an emergency, the majority of schools do not have an alternative or backup system to their public address system. Not all areas of the school can hear a public address announcement. If we think about cafeterias, gymnasiums, and music rooms with louder ambient noise. Again, just like the other two recommendations, there's no identified replacement cycle or funding for this equipment. Though our focus in REMAC was to look at physical security needs, it's important to note two areas that were also highlighted by the advisory committee. First, mental health systems, supports, and their training are an important part of ensuring schools are safe and secure, and the district should increase their investment in these areas. Second, as we expand our security and risk management initiatives, we need to ensure we have the operational support necessary to train, monitor, and sustain these important systems. I will now turn it back to Troy for our recommendations.
Thanks, Dave. I think it's important to note the two additional comments from REMAC as well. That was very important to that group when we were preparing the report and they had a chance to review and summarize it. At the end, they were concerned that there wasn't enough emphasis around some of those supports like mental health. Again, we were tasked with a priority around physical facilities and security, but we also understand how important that is, and we've heard that numerous times from our board members, our community, and our teachers and staff. So I wanted to highlight that before I get to our conclusion. In our conclusion, the risk management recommendations with the endorsement of REMAC are to improve main entrances and perimeter security at all schools. This would entail implementing the 7 components of a secure single point of entry that Dave shared earlier. This would include the renovations of 3 comprehensive high schools, as well as entrance bollards and door alarms where needed. And I think it's important to recognize and also share that when you've heard from the Next Generation Learning, they talked about a lot of different spaces that open things up, that have glass, that have things on display, and that may or may not appear to some to be a concern around safety. What's encouraging and where the collaboration and the connection comes together in my mind is the opportunity to make a secure facility that allows the open space within and allows our kids to have that warm and welcoming and safe and secure environment to travel and to travel and transport their learning to different spaces and feel comfortable about that. So although I do entertain and have interest when you talk about the open lunch periods where you go around, that is concerning. When it looks to the campus style and what we do in our recommendations, I think we have that connection well dialed in there. Our second is to improve and expand the district camera system and infrastructure to all schools, specifically the 10 elementary schools, the athletic facilities, and the high school parking lots. And why that's narrowed down is because we do have a large system of cameras already, and we've seen some really great opportunities with our administrators on how to manage large buildings and large campuses with a quick access of a camera or a tool at their hand. And number 3 is to improve the day-to-day communication systems and mass communication systems in all schools. This would be accomplished by installing district-wide digital radio systems that allow better clarity and functionality. Private talk groups and district-wide communications is something that we are looking to enhance and improve, and we believe this tool, through some exploration that we've already begun, would improve that. And also message boards and signals to alert staff to an emergency in a school. Think about places like shopping malls, airports, and other large venues. You see these large digital displays already that inform people and get people moving in directions and doing activities that are necessary quickly. Lastly, and I think one of the most important things is to establish product replacement cycles and establish funding mechanisms to support these important safety features for our schools today and into the future. This equipment and these requests are significant investments of our taxpayers and of our district, and you can make infusions here and there, but as fast as you do, our equipment and our technology ages and needs to be replaced. I will now turn it over to Ron for closing comments.
So I think it's important to note that these recommendations are based on the current best practices to address risks that we are currently confronted with. But we know, however, that these risks continue to evolve. So our risk management team will continue to partner with our REMAC team and other stakeholders to stay up to date with best practices and to continue to stay focused on ensuring all of our facilities are safe and welcoming. With that, we'll open it up to board members for any questions you might have.
I have a few questions. A few times you've said there's not funding for it, so I just want to clarify what is meant by that. So is that meant to say that the state formulas and sources of funding don't provide for this because there hasn't been a question or an ask that's come to the board that's been denied? I just want to clarify funding this versus providing expenditures as a district on this.
There's a few different ways that we have been able to fund some of these projects over the last several years. Dave mentioned one of them, the school safety grant that we were able to outfit 4 of our schools. Typically, the dollars that we're using, though, for some of these projects are coming from our regular budgeting process through the capital project process. And so as you know, through our budgeting process, there's a lot of competing interests and a lot of really important things that we're trying to fund with limited capital dollars. And so that's why it's a phased process. We don't have a dedicated funding stream from the legislature specifically for safety improvements. And so one of the things that you know has been on our legislative platform, as well as AMSD and other organizations, is to open up and give us some flexibility with LTFM to be able to use for the physical structures. Because again, some of the school safety funding that we do get is used for things like mental health and SROs and things like that. So it's not necessarily for the actual facilities, and that's where those competing interests come into play. So there are some different funding sources. We're just competing with other important things that we have to do as well.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure that was clarified, so
Yeah.
there's not an impression that we're not choosing
No,
to
and I didn't
spend on
want
this.
that to be the intention or the outcome, but I think it's important to note that the competition, as Ron mentioned, is for those dollars is very important. And we've taken the initiative in our own department to try to find a unique funding sources and/or to tackle that true question. Dave's been down to the legislature and presented in front of committees with Patricia Magnuson, our former executive director. In the past couple of years, we've had it in legislative platforms, and we're going to continue to push for that and what we're looking for is a permanent funding stream that would be directed to safety and security that would allow us to continue to have that funding opportunity.
And when you talked about the different improvements that need to be made and that there's only, some of them only exist at some schools, do you have an aggregate estimated cost if we were to bring all of our schools up to a maybe certain basic level that you feel would be a step change forward?
So our next steps are to put together, we've already begun that work, to put together our pricing model for the integrated facility planning piece. And so those things are coming, I think, in the next couple of weeks.
So
We'll have that wrapped up.
Yep, the Oversight Task Force will have that information as they go about their business.
But we've been able to use the pricing through the grants and through the quote process to determine that. It's just a matter of applying that to the overall projects.
Okay.
A question for Dave, on a national basis, we talked about exterior threats or external threats and internal threats. In a typical school, what amount of the violence is from people already authorized to be in there versus those who come from the outside?
If you're speaking specifically, most widely known would be on a school shooting. If it's school shooting, if it's in a secondary school, it's going to be an insider. Somebody that's already in the building, typically a student or a former student. Elementary school, it's typically an outsider coming in. So if you're looking at school shootings, like I said, it's secondaries, insiders, elementary schools, somebody from the outside.
Okay, thank you.
I had a question, kind of jumping off of what Mike was saying. I think that not just in school shootings, but in a lot of scenarios, the dangers come from within the school, or the people who are authorized to be in the school, I should say. And I see that REMAC put an emphasis on importance of mental health, but that was not one of your recommendations. But we know that students are harming each other and themselves due to mental health concerns all the time, and that most kids who commit school shootings also have mental health needs. I really feel like that should be higher up on our list of priorities as a preventative approach to disruptions to school.
Yeah, and I think, and I would say that our current REMAC would agree with that. I think where we're at with REMAC is when we've been studying security upgrades for a building, we've been focusing on camera systems, card access systems, what that looks like. It's really only been this school year that REMAC has had a strong interest of saying, what does this look like? So we haven't had that time to really process that and really do a deep dive in what the kind of our mental health services look like in our school and how they support that. That being said, the REMAC meeting that is tomorrow at 2:30 is fully devoted to learning more about those services in our district. So that's,
A distinction is our mental health services are services, programmatic services, not facilities. So we're trying to marry the two
Yes.
together.
Yeah,
There's
that,
a
and that's what I was gonna.
Yep, no, if we expanded our mental health services, we need the facility infrastructure to support that. So I think we agree.
Yes.
The importance of it. When you get into the kind of more of a facilities frame, I don't want to ever suggest it's less important. It's just,
Oh.
it's more of a programmatic need than it is
Right.
a facilities.
You were
focus.
kinder than the committee was when we put together the report. They would have moved it to the top as well. And that's why we delineated it from it, or shared with you and identified it right away in the report about the physical security, how that looks. But mental health is a top priority. And if you're interested, you're welcome to attend tomorrow and learn more with what we're going to be sharing with them as well.
Thank you. Have you seen any research that says what is the best way to prevent violence from within the school? Like, is there a comparison of return on investment on physical things versus mental health things and how that, plays out? Not that I want to say one is better than the other, but.
well, yeah, I would say, kind of taking it, I think the big thing when we talk about violence that is occurring, that is erupting from in our school, it really comes down to relationships and connections that students have with their school, with their staff, their teachers, with their peers. That would be key. And if something were to arise that concern them, that they have trusting relationship with adults, that they can share that information. I think that is being able to identify students that are potentially on a pathway to violence and, like I said, those connections and those relationships and what that culture feels like in the school, PBIS programs, those are huge.
And I think that debate is, Jackie, as you probably are aware, is one that's in the forefront right now. Tell me what's more valuable, the education, the training, the mental supports, the different things we can put in there from the human element, or the physical things. And our group, the risk management team, we go back and forth, and we try to find where is that balance, and then we work with student services and other groups to connect. And as our department really has developed and evolved over the last 3 or 4 years with the help of REMAC, we've started making really strong inroads and relationships with Sarah and her team, Kate Emmons and her team, and we've recently connected with our SRO programming. And what does that look like, and what are our expectations for our law enforcement partners in the schools, and then our administrative groups, and what does that look like? And so we are taking a phased approach on the mechanical and technical stuff, but we're also jumping in deep going, how do we learn more about this, and how do we exploit those resources that are already in our system?
You're going to have more questions on this too, I know it. So please keep those coming our way, write them down, get us those questions as
I
follow-ups.
did have one other quick question. I noticed that one of the things was strobe lighting. Are we concerned about kids with epilepsy or people who get migraines or?
The vast majority of those lights that we're talking about are actually exterior.
Okay,
So as you come up to a building,
It's to alert
Got it.
staff that are outside that something is occurring inside the building.
thank you for
not something
clarifying
right
that.
in the classroom, yeah.
Correct.
I appreciate that.
I want to say thank you again, team, for the work of the committee and the recommendations. And again, I'll just kind of hit it again, that these will all go to the oversight task force for prioritization, funding options, that additional work will happen. Okay, I'm moving us on to athletic facilities, and we're about at 8:15, so we're within our timeline, generally speaking. So I'm going to turn over to Sarah Vernig for leading into this last of our fourth section here.
Good evening, everyone. Before I get started, I do want to say thank you very much to Kim Riesgraf, who worked very collaboratively with us on several projects, but particularly with myself on the athletic facilities audit, the independent audit, and then also developing and designing the process around how we evaluated that audit. In addition to our 3 activities coordinators are here tonight too, if you have any additional thoughts or questions for them. John Hedstrom from Park Center, Bill Kwan from Osseo Senior High, and then Ricardo Jones from Maple Grove Senior High, who were at very important student events, but couldn't miss this riveting presentation tonight, so.
Really, Sarah? You brought friends.
I did. My focus tonight is to present the findings and recommendations on 2 different components, but specifically related to student activities. The independent facilities audit that we had completed by an outside consultant, and then also give you collaborative recommendations based on the feedback that we received from that. Last spring, Kim Riesgraf and I met with the independent consultant Don Sigalo from Minnesota Partnerships, LLC. The company was contracted to complete a facilities audit for Osseo area schools and provide a comparison of 20 benchmark high schools. The purpose of the audit was to determine current deficiencies and make short-term and long-term recommendations for improvements that would continue to keep our sites comparable to the conference and select schools included in that report. And that report is also included in your board packet under Appendix A. The independent consultants met with ISD 279 activity coordinators, toured sites and facilities, and reviewed the findings with the group, including Kim Riesgraf and myself. The findings were then presented to the Activities Parent Program Advisory Committee, or called APAC, for feedback and input. The committee consists of a variety of stakeholders, including coaches, parents, students, community members, and other additional stakeholders. In addition, principals and activity coordinators provided feedback on the audit in a separate meeting. The audit and the committees have completed the work as of mid-October 2019. Minnesota Partnerships categorized their findings on the independent audit into 3 categories. Number 1, critical needs and safety issues. Number 2, basic needs. And then the third one was competitive needs. I'm going to begin by reviewing the critical needs in the audit first. Critical needs, as defined by the audit, are improvements that need to occur as soon as possible. The first one is that stadium turf surfaces for all 3 high schools are around 12 years old. They are beyond the useful life of 10 years, and the highly compacted, worn-out turf poses a safety issue and should be replaced in 2020. The second recommendation that the independent audit made was a hoist for wrestling mats in the main gymnasium needs to be installed at Park Center Senior High because the current system of moving mats, i.e. manual labor and students, poses a safety issue and should be installed in 2020. Next, we move on to the basic needs recommendations from the independent audit. These basic needs recommendations are supported by the benchmarking analysis to meet the average standard for schools that were included in the study. And if you're looking for a list of those schools, they are included in the facilities audit report as well. First, a wrestling room needs to be built or remodeled in existing spaces at Park Center Senior High School. Short-term solutions to resolve the wrestling room issue at Park Center Senior High School should be a high priority. Park Center is the only school among all of the schools benchmarked in this report without an enclosed, dedicated wrestling room. Second, reconstruct the current configuration of the 8 tennis courts at Osseo Senior High School and expand them from 8 to 10 courts at both Maple Grove and Osseo Senior High School. And it's needed due to participation numbers and should be completed in the next 1 to 2 years. Maple Grove Senior High School track was last resurfaced 8 years ago and should be resurfaced in the next 2 to 3 years. Replacement of all 3 stadium scoreboards and addition of a main gym video board at Park Center Senior High School in the next 2 to 5 years. Currently, Park Center Senior High School is the only one that does not have a video board in their main gym. Better utilization of storage space by installing mechanical systems to help optimize our storage space at all the schools should be an annual funding priority. Replacement of the cardio equipment, meaning things like treadmills, bikes, other equipment that's located in our fitness center at Osseo Senior High should be replaced because it is past its life expectancy within the next 1 to 2 years. In addition to the scoreboards, all stadium facilities, since they are approaching over 20 years old, should develop a timetable for bleacher replacement, installation of Wi-Fi and press boxes, press box replacement, installation of indoor bathrooms at Osseo Senior High School and Park Center Senior High School, lighting replacement, storage enhancement, and consideration of lockers for football and soccer, track, and lacrosse collaboratively would use within the stadium bleachers. This plan should be developed in the next 1 to 2 years in order to provide for a funding timeline in a 3 to 10 year range. The last category of the independent audit is competitive needs. The competitive needs recommendations are based on top performing schools' athletic facilities in this report to enhance the Osseo area schools' ability to compete with conference, open enrollment, and private schools. The first recommendation they make is a district-wide athletic facility that's recommended that would be similar to Hopkins Lindbergh Center, Eden Prairie Activity Center, and the St. Michael Albertville Activity Center. Several other districts also have complexes that go beyond gymnasium space, such as the Anoka Fieldhouse, Centennial Sports Arena, Champlain Park Fieldhouse, and the Rogers Fieldhouse. In all, 5 of the 11 public school districts benchmarked in this report have a state-of-the-art indoor athletic facility. This facility should be built at a geographically central location for all 3 senior high schools. The facility should include things like gymnasiums, a gymnastics facility, competitive level swimming pool, diving facility, a training room, multi-purpose facilities for dance and cheer, classroom space, meeting spaces, an indoor-outdoor walking track, fitness space, and flexible spaces to accommodate future undefined needs. The second competitive recommendation they make is a dome at senior high school, which would provide enhanced curricular use for Osseo Senior High during the winter months in the same capacity as Maple Grove and as Park Center Senior High School. The third recommendation that they make is a feasibility study to provide fully turfed baseball fields and should be conducted prior to a plan to renovate the baseball fields, particularly the varsity ones, at each senior high school. At this time, the recommendation in the needs area is to install turf in fields, but not outfields. So I'm trying to make the distinction around the basic versus competitive. There is a high demand for all turf baseball fields in the metro area, and if much of the cost can be offset with rental fees, all turf baseball fields would be a major competitive advantage over the conference competition. The next piece that they would recommend is a review of the feasibility of upgrading stadium scoreboards from scoreboard replacement, as mentioned in the basic recommendations, at each of the senior high schools to video boards, while also adding that video board to the main gym at Park Center Senior High School, not as a replacement for the video board at Park Center Senior High, as made in previous recommendations. After we received the report back, we took the report and the executive summary and the findings to 2 different groups. Both of the groups were presented the findings of the audit. the lead high school principals and the activities coordinators in one group, and then the Activities Program Advisory Committee, as I mentioned, is known as APAC. Once again, those members consist of a variety of stakeholders, and the most important people playing in there are our students, our athletes, our community members, and our coaches who use these facilities on almost a daily basis. Out of those two groups came some themes and some collective recommendations when we gathered feedback from all of the people who were asked for it. While the audit made certain recommendations within these three categories, just as a reminder, the critical, the basic, and the competitive, APAC and administration at site at district level shared additional information to take into account that would support and change some of those recommendations. The first one is that there was a unanimous agreement that Park Center needs a hoist for wrestling mats because moving them manually poses a safety issue. The second one is that all three high schools are in need of storage space for growing programs. That tended to resonate heavily, especially with coaches and athletes. The turf fields at the stadiums of all three high schools will need to be replaced in the next probably 1 to 3 years. The additional information, instead of suggesting that it was a safety issue or pose that it needed to be replaced in the next year, is that the turf fields are safety tested by field turf representatives each year, and they feel that the fields could last us another couple of years if properly maintained. Fourth, all three football stadium scoreboards need to be replaced. Baseball and softball scoreboards need to be replaced at Maple Grove and Park Center. These scoreboards are lacking in parts and have deficiencies with them where we're not able to get those components anymore to fix them. Osseo Senior High needs a softball scoreboard update with some improvements, but not replacement as it is newer. Additional facilities recommendations were that weight room updates and space is needed at all three high school, again, due to participation numbers growing and increasing in each of our activities in athletics. More tennis courts to serve the program numbers are needed at Osseo Maple Grove Senior, again, due to large participation counts at both of those sites. Baseball and softball infield should be examined for drainage capability. For example, Maple Grove Senior softball field may just require extra or additional drainage rather than a full turfing. Maple Grove Senior's baseball field should be completely turfed due to the poor drainage and land issues that are surrounding it. The last recommendation is that the committee and stakeholders agree that there should be a tiered approach to the remaining project as part of the long-term facility management planning. I'd also like to note that on two of the recommendations that were made in the competitive needs in the facilities independent audit, the stakeholders didn't support putting a dome at Osseo Senior High because they were aware that there physically is not space for it on the land, nor building a district-wide activity facility because it's extremely cost prohibitive. And with that, that's a lot of information, all crammed into about 10 minutes, so I'll take any questions you
Well,
have.
and board members, I'd like to add, again, a thank you to our athletic coordinators and all the participation from our APAC team and the hard work that went into this. And really, if you can sense it, digging into those recommendations and a kind of a practical approach to what from a day-to-day usage perspective, making those audit recommendations kind of real for us. And I just want to thank that hard work and heavy lifting that was done, no pun intended, with the groups that worked on this particular area. So we're looking for feedback, we're looking for questions that we can carry with us into that oversight task force work where they'll, again, do prioritization. And one thing that I know you understand is this is an area where we can utilize our LTFM dollars potentially to map this out based on some of those recommendations that are kind of spread out over time. And clearly the tiered approach is the way we framed this up is what's most in front of us and then all the way to what would be nice kind of categories. So with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Can you help explain the competitive need perspective in a bit more detail? Because it seems like it's much more about we have, they have, we want to have, versus how does it compel me to believe that our students are going to be better student athletes if we have these things that other schools have?
Well, you're exactly right. You kind of just answered your own question. When you look around at some of the other people that they surveyed that aren't necessarily in our conference, but are part of some of our private schools within our district that we compete against in sports or activities or clubs, they have dedicated spaces, rooms, updated facilities, things that we don't have. And so those competitive needs are based on, when you look at, generally speaking, what are you seeing kind of the top tier, most state-of-the-art facilities having? And so they're saying in order to compete with those, that's what you would want to look at.
It's a competing amongst facilities, not improving our students' ability to compete as student
Yes.
athletes.
Competing
Yes.
amongst other schools.
Yes.
Okay.
But not competition like you're thinking like, we're gonna go win every game now.
No, well, I just want to clarify because it can mean different things to different people.
Right.
Yes.
And I'm not sure that I want to win a competitive war with other
Right.
costly districts.
And some of those districts that we listed in there, you have single donors writing
Yes.
checks for $5 million to do this.
Exactly.
So, we're not competing against that.
Which leads me to another question is, was there any analysis in terms of percent of funds that go into funding athletic facilities in terms of the audit? So percent that are private funds, school district funds, other public entities, or do you have any information so we can kind of understand?
We've got some anecdotal information, as Mike kind of mentioned. We did not include that because this, as we've kind of talked about tonight, was really a facilities audit, not necessarily a funding audit. There was some conversations that happened, obviously with our ACs that happened with us that we know about, but nothing that we could specifically point to at this point. But again, that's because we were focused on just facilities, not the funding.
So I see nothing in here about sheets of ice. We're good with that.
I think we're past the sheet of ice, Mike.
No.
There's nothing in there on ice.
Okay.
That was not a recommendation from the audit or.
So just to clarify that point, Mike, ice arenas and pools were not included in the athletic facilities audit. And the reason is because most don't own their own ice arenas. They either have a community center they're using or they go to a public one, but they don't have their own, so it didn't seem like it was worth investigating the comparability of them because everybody's using different facilities through community ed or cities rather than owning their own.
Comparability is one thing. I mean, Ice Arena, we just spent a couple $1 million between us and our boosters, great community partners, Omega,
Yes.
to do that. But the pools, I believe Northview was just ripped up last year, but, it may not, no? No. Then I don't know what I was.
It's not ripped out. It's
They're
not
ripped
filled.
out.
Right.
I mean, it was being redone. Ripped up, was it not?
It's not ripped up,
It's not
we're not
filled.
currently utilizing it.
Oh, okay. I just remember construction around that area when I went through. But the issue around, if we have to look at, what do we need to spend money on? We didn't look at the pool, pools from a competitive thing is one thing, but do we have to fix any of the pools? And those are some pretty high cost items going forward, and
The
they're not
pool-
listed in here.
Yeah, the pools, we did not compare. Again, some of it was due to the timing and being able to access the schools because this was all taking place in the spring and then into the summer. But again, most of them are not located on site, and if they are, they're at the middle schools.
Right.
And so it wasn't something that when you look at it, some people are going to different places like Swim Academy, or they're using other community pools to service their swim programs rather than owning their own.
Right, but we've talked about we need to replace turf because it's old. Do we need to replace pool stuff because it's old? That's what I'm asking about.
Right.
It is something that I think you should,
Yeah, we can
something that
follow
we
up
need
on
to
that.
look into.
Yeah,
Because it is
that's a
one
big
of our
chunk.
athletic programs.
We have a guest
They
speaker.
I just wanted to clarify, we've sunk millions of dollars into our pool renovations. Back in the early 2000s, we redid all the ventilation systems to meet standards. We've done all the redone all the sumps to meet the building requirements that were recently established after the child was hurt at the bottom of a pool. We've redone the tiles. We've totally redone the inside of Osseo Middle's pool, and we've done all the locker rooms associated with that, and we've done the locker rooms at Northview, and we're waiting to see the outcome of this to see what we want to do with that pool. So if in fact we don't have the demand for 3 pools or 4 pools, we can use the space to help with some of our other needs. And some of the ideas thrown out there are possibly a venue for gymnastics or a venue for wrestling that we do have a need for. So we're still wrestling around with that. But one of the things that we've been really thorough about is making sure that our pools are meeting the standards. We've got new diving, we've taken out diving boards where we can't use them, and we have new starting blocks and that sort of thing. So we're meeting standards.
Well, I'd like to, say, this is really interesting, these findings. I do think we need to be competitive as a district when it comes to athletics. It's something that it provides great pride for our students and their families to come to this district, and a lot of our student athletes are also achieve really well academically, so there's a lot to be proud of there. So I do think it makes a difference. I do think, I do have a student athlete, and I know that when they go to other gyms, it matters to them for sure, and parents. And it's not cheap to be involved in this stuff. So I think there is an expectation from families that there is some competitiveness around it. I do have a question though around our middle school sports. Why don't we offer middle school sports? I'm just curious.
Kelly, do you want to talk about this one since you were here?
Yeah.
I can give the short answer, but.
So I don't even remember exactly when.
Kim?
2008? 2008. We had to make a number of cuts, like tremendous cuts in our school district. And one of the ways, so when we brought people together then to do our financial work like we do right now, we decided we had to tier things about what, so it couldn't, clearly the last thing we want to touch are the classrooms, right? So one, with the teachers. So one of the things was getting rid of junior high athletics and having those students play up into the senior highs for some of the sports. And so like we used to have 7th and 8th grade basketball and stuff, now we don't. And we had the other junior high sports, but we had to cut those due to budget restrictions. We couldn't afford it.
And many communities pick that up through their
Yeah.
association.
Yep, social, yep.
Association.
they're-
And those are very expensive for
They are,
people.
Depends-
Very
Yeah.
expensive.
So one of the things to answer part of this question too, that I do think is unique that you don't see in some other districts that are represented in the study, is they don't offer them at all. Like, they don't allow participation, for example, in some of the schools when you're a middle schooler. We do have some sports that kids, as Kelly mentioned, can play up into or can join. So things like cross-country, track, tennis, gymnastics. We have a list of them in the reports of what kids can play up to once they become a 7th or 8th grader they can play in, which is unique because in other schools, they either don't have them at all or they have small, short, stinted time frames. So they might have a 4-week boys tennis or a 4-week basketball or a 4-week volleyball, but they're functioning from the schools as more of
Intramural.
an intramural, yes, sport that is run by the school, or they are taking them through
But not
community ed.
competitive.
Yeah, so that is one thing that, even though they were cut, that we do offer that many sites don't.
Well, I would like to take, a question like that as part of the oversight committee, talk to our community about, and I want to hear from families, because I think I've heard It's a missing piece about our athletic programs and really fostering our students. And not everybody, of course, is going to be a high school athlete, but you know, if you don't have the funds to participate in, you know, whether it's, what is it, BPA or OMGBA, I mean, it's costly for
It is.
families. And so, especially if you have multiple students or children. So I think that this would be a question, because I mean, I'm looking at this list and I see a lot of middle school sports offered, and then they also have the opportunity to participate in 7th grade at, you know, for varsity sports.
So
I
back,
think we'd look at
back when it was, when the decision was made to cut that programming, like now, you know how we have the long range financial planning group right now, it was not that, you know, we used to do zero-based budgeting and other type of budgeting processes, but the thing that was the same with the long-range facility planning we do right now is there is always a fiscal committee that was, you know, made up of parents and community members and others, and they really had the final oversight and on the recommendations that we were making, so you have to cut, this is not something to be quoted because it's not the right amount, but let's say 20 million. And so then we would make the recommendations, and then they came back, and then they prioritized, and they came down with the final recommendations, and it actually was that group that wanted to go to the athletics before they ever went into the classroom. So that was a decision made by that group to cut the middle school programming, junior high at that time.
Yeah, I understand that. But I mean, I think that we have, what happens though is that you have students in middle school trying out for high school sports, bumps other 9th graders and 10th graders out of their sports, and then you have like really upset families that then are like, don't want to be involved at all. And then we lose a capture of really engaged and involved. So I just think it's worth looking into.
Yeah, it was very emotional.
So
It
one
was
of the
really
things I would
emotional.
say is that our sports with middle school typically are not cut sports. So we don't cut in many of our sports. Basketball might be an exception, but for an 8th grader to get pulled up is rare.
Well, I mean, I've witnessed it.
Right,
I don't need
I'm
you guys
just
to go
saying
back
over
and
the
forth with
course
me. I'm
of
just
year.
saying that
No,
this is what
just
I
so
think
you
we should
guys
look
have
at.
the information, most of it is non-cut sports that they participate in, so we have like hundreds of kids in track.
It's always good to look back and review it again, because it was very
Yeah.
emotional at the time as well.
I just wanted to add on to what Kelsey was saying about the programming for middle school. I've also heard a lot of similar sentiment that there's something lacking and families want middle school sports. And I do think our oversight task force should review that and consider that as an option. But I also want to ask, is there a reason why 6th grade is not included in that? Because that's another one that I hear a lot about is the 6th grade. And also, a lot of people have no idea that their middle school students can join some of these high school sports. And I think that would, you know, so we're talking about like a marketing advertisement issue there, but.
That's so good, the ACs are sitting here. Well, I believe the so that they're hearing all of this.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the 6th grade piece is due to state high school rules.
It's due to eligibility. They only get 6 years of eligibility at the Minnesota State High School League. So if they start as a 6th grader, they wouldn't be able to play as a senior.
So, and that's true even if we had middle school age sports, that would still apply. Okay. I thought it was something like that, but I wanted to clarify before I said that you guys should
And it
add
is
6th
something
grade.
different. I mean, it was
But-
really, really hard. We know that co and extracurricular activities are really the strongest interventions we offer students.
Right.
You know, we know that.
And then when it comes
So
to
it's hard.
this, sorry, I also wanted to say that I appreciate you acknowledging that even though some things were recommended as things that we could need, they were just absolutely not going to happen, like the dome and the multi-sport complex, which would be super fun to have, but very cost prohibitive, just acknowledging right away that those aren't the recommendations. So, thank you.
On the question of middle school sports, I'm in agreement with other board members on that need and evaluation. Do we have facilities that could, when I observe the middle school sites and their connectedness to the high school sites as well, it seems like we have facilities that could support middle school sports. Is that a fair
Yes,
assumption?
we did. So when Laurel and I, where are you, Laurel? When we were principals at the junior highs back then, when it was cut, or not when it was cut, but when they were starting to talk about it, we absolutely supported all of those in the schools at the time, and they still could.
Okay.
John, can you think we can support the difference is our numbers have grown exponentially with grade configuration. We're taking a lot of space.
But they competed at the junior highs.
Right, but yes.
But the
Yeah.
high school programs compete at the junior highs and practice at the junior highs, like Maple Grove.
It's just kind of reality.
Right, because our increase in numbers and teams.
We
Sounds like they're.
We can easily just look into this again and collect more, more information is needed, right? These are great questions, and I think more on this one too, with the middle school sports specifically.
Another question I have, and I sent a host of them over, we
did.
can get to them as follow-ups. But another question I have was I was hoping that there'd be a little bit more insight about potential understanding of equity amongst our schools in regard to athletic facilities, and that didn't really necessarily come out as any insights. So, did any concerns emerge or any insights about ensuring that we've got equitable athletic facilities?
No, in fact, what I would say, I was a little surprised when we did the process, and you guys, I mean, honestly, feel free to chime in on this, but if I'm wrong. They really were focused on, what their sites needed and wanted at each of the respective schools, and they each shared out what each other was thinking or saying, this is what we would need, and there was really no pushback whatsoever. I mean, they said, yep, we need a wrestling hoist at Park Center. Yep, we need more storage space. Osseo Senior needs to have, this for their weight room or their cardio room. And so I was kind of surprised there wasn't more pushback about some of the things that were recommended or not recommended, but they really did a nice job of recognizing what is it we need versus what's a want. And what would help us to feel like we're in a space, like you said, that really felt good and felt like we could take pride and ownership in it. And that's super important to them.
Some of the recommendation, or the commentary about number of fields per team. I mean, we're landlocked in almost all of our schools. So I don't know if that's a really fair comparison to say, because we have no place to build it unless we start buying houses and knocking them down. So, that's not really something that's on the table. Just like, we're not gonna do a dome, we're not gonna do this. We're not gonna build 4 more baseball fields because there's no room to do it.
Right.
There's community assets that we can always partner with the cities in terms of utilizing their fields.
Yeah, it's utilizing fields,
Yeah.
but it's like we've done with Maple Grove. They built 4 fields, and all of a sudden, our numbers for Maple Grove looks ridiculous because they just gifted us with 4 fields. But yeah, some of the other things, if we're talking about on campus, there's really no
think of Park
ability to
Center
do that. But if
how
there's
landlocked
other
it is.
opportunities, we'd have to look at that.
And I think that's why they made that recommendation about that district activity center. And again, it's quite expensive, so we've tried to focus the ACs, the group, in looking at how can we maximize the space we currently own. As Kelly mentioned, Park Center is the most landlocked school with the least amount of space to be making any additions. And so how do we help utilize that space as much as possible? And we know that some of that might have to be through facilities where we look at remodeling spaces to add on or not, rather than, I guess I should say, remodel it to fix it, to make sure that we're getting the needs we have rather than adding on.
So board members, what you saw tonight in this particular area, and it was a bit unique because we had the outside audit. You heard what the outside audit recommended, and then you saw sort of some reprioritization from our internal staff. And what, it's really up to us to decide what to do with those recommendations and how to elevate those or, move those into the spaces that make sense for us. So that another phase of that will happen with our Oversight Task Force Committee. The middle school sports piece wasn't there, but that's the feedback I'm hearing from you, and we can, study that further, get some more information on that and see where we want to go. With that, I just want to stress again, and we're going to kind of transition into that oversight piece. I'll just give you a quick overview of that work, but I knew this would get a lot of attention. The athletic facilities always do, and there's lots of passion around this. And I have to say thank you again to the athletic coordinators and those that were a part of this. It was nice to see an outside view of what, how we're evaluated against other, where we can be comparably looked at. But to hear some internal conversation about what our needs are in relation to those, I'm proud of how they handle that information. So I'm going to transition us into kind of this last section of our presentation tonight. You've done a great job hanging in there. It's a lot. Months and years of work coming to a head here. So next step, our oversight task force comes to you, or that starts here next month, and or later this month even. We're working on dates. We've already been working on participation, which I'll get to in a second. But their primary job is to review the findings in these observations and recommendations and really take a run at prioritizing those, looking at different funding options for how we can potentially fund source those, and then bring recommendations back to me that I will bring back to you. And my goal is March or April. And I leave that kind of loose or flexible because I want to give that oversight task force the space to complete their work. And if they need a little extra time, it's worth it. It's worth getting that really dialed in. So it could happen quickly, but maybe they need an extra session. So if it trips into April, then they'll bring those to me. I'll bring those to you for additional feedback and next steps on what actions do you want to take with all these areas. You just heard 45 different recommendations tonight in 4 different areas, right? So we have some work to do now. That was our first step, and how to drill these down into where we want them to be as from a prioritization standpoint, and how can we fund those things in different ways. The committee is comprised of Ron Meyer will chair this. We have 2 board members. Tanya and Kelsey are representing the board on that committee. We have our 3 assistant superintendents. We also have 4 elementary principals, and I think they're all here tonight. They were. We have Margot from Rice Lake and Sean from Crestview. And then, I think Kim was
sick.
Kim was not here tonight. Kim Manette from Brooklyn Middle, and then Michael Lehan from Osseo High School will be a part of that committee, along with Dale Carlstrom, Sarah Vernig, and Jeremy Willie. So Ron is working already on getting those dates on the calendar. We got a tight timeline to get a lot of work done to bring that back to the board. So in the shorter term, though, after tonight, there's just so much here. I'm going to continue to say it. Please funnel questions to myself or Ron so we can ensure those get to the oversight task force, or even just for your own clarity on something that you heard tonight, so that we can follow up. And Vice Chair Simons has already sent us a nice list after reading the packet. So that's what this is about. We need to make sure you're armed with information as we move forward in our decision making. So with that, I think it's 5 to 9. We did really well on our timing. Again, our end game is no later than June, giving you the opportunity to take some action on the recommendations and options coming your way by mid-spring. So we're on track with our timeline. With that, we didn't leave much time for additional questions. Are there any follow-up additional questions, even on process or procedure? One last thank you to all who presented, all who have participated in this work, and just greatly appreciate all the time and energy that's gone into all of these areas that we've been looking into and studying in depth. So with that, Chair Ostafi, I'll give it back to you.
All right. With that, board members, are there any other questions from this evening or process going forward? Okay, and I think I can just say meeting's adjourned. It's 8:55 p.m. Thank you.
Woo-hoo.